Hey everybody, I'm Phil, and it's Del Toro time. It's Del Toro time. And I am all by myself because my regular co-host, Willow, could not be with us today, and for just myriad reasons. There's it's nothing to worry about. She just couldn't be here today. And because of that, I'm not going to be covering our short story, because that would be weird and uncalled for. I don't like talking about the stuff that we're supposed to talk about together by myself. But I didn't want to leave you hanging. I didn't want to just not have an episode this week. So I thought what would be fun, since it is October the something, it'd be fun to just sort of go through what I'm reading, what I'm watching, what I've, like, horror that I've been diving into besides the stuff that we cover for the show, because I'm clearly reading and watching more than one short story a week in my personal life. And also besides the Berenstain Bears stuff I cover on Deep in Bear Country. So I just wanted to, I don't know, just talk about this because Willow and I don't really have a chance to talk about it on the actual show proper. And there's been a few things that I've been kind of into recently, not necessarily like highbrow stuff, but I don't need the highbrow. I get enough highbrow in my daily life simply by going through the thoughts that are in my head. The super intelligent thoughts that I'm constantly thinking about are highbrow enough. So let's take a look at what I have been taking a look at recently. One thing that I've kind of gotten into in the last month or so has been the SİCCÜN series. The SİCCÜN series is a 6-film Turkish horror series that's been going on since I think like 2016? 2016. I have the information pulled up, but of course I scanned away from it as I am an intelligent human being who is intelligent. I'm a very smart man, and it's a 6-film horror series put together by Alper. Again, I am not Turkish. I do not speak any of this language. I do not pronounce anything correctly. By filmmaker and writer and journalist Alper Mesci. I'm just going to let it go with that. Who got his start as a writer and a screenwriter, and then he started doing his own movies. He does comedies, he does thrillers, he does horror movies, and the SİCCÜN series is kind of his, like, it's kind of his calling card. These movies are not phenomenal. They are not groundbreaking. They are not changing the face of horror in any way, but they are very entertaining and very well made. I never know what to expect going into a film series from a country that I'm not familiar with. I'm not familiar with their customs. I'm not familiar with their culture or their language or anything. And it's always fascinating seeing, like, what do you consider scary? What is scary in your culture? And the SİCCÜN series is fascinating to me because it has a lot of the tropes of just generic American. You've dabbled in like magics and demonology. You've stuff very similar to what you'll find in your like conjurings, I guess. Sort of like you thought you were dealing with a good spirit, but it's an evil spirit. Except in this case, you thought you were dabbling with an evil spirit, and it's pretty much just an evil spirit. You were right. So each film deals with different characters, but there's some like crossover in the magics involved, in the demons involved. There's a lot of like jinns involved. Like there's sort of domestic horror in that we are dealing with, we want to have a spirit that will help us land a man, or get back in contact with my dead child, or reunite me with a family member. And we're going into this understanding that it's not going to go well for us in any way, shape, or form. And then it just goes way worse for us than we were even expecting it to. It's kind of the series. These are excessively gory films, excruciating body horror involved in a lot of these. The special effects are pretty dynamite, I would have to say. Not knowing what to, these are very low budget movies that look a lot higher budget than I was expecting them to. The acting is great across the board. The acting's a little soap opera-y at times. Like if you've watched any like telenovelas, you're operating at about that level at times. But that's fine because they are aware of what they are. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel. You're going to hear me say that a couple of times in this episode. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel horror-wise, but they are trying to be true to their own cultural identity, I guess, is what I love about them. Is they're not trying to be American horror films. They are not trying to be Japanese horror films or Korean horror films. These are Turkish horror films. And so they don't hold your hand when it comes to most of the population is Muslim. So that is where the horror comes from. Their own, the characters have different personal relationships with Islam, with their level of devotion to that culture, to Islamic, to their faith. And they're not going to try to explain anything to you because they are anticipating that if you're watching this movie, that going in, you are fully prepared to just jump in with both feet into an Islamic culture. And I respect that because they don't explain anything to you. It actually makes it easier to follow. You're not being thrown a lot of concepts and names and touchstones that you have to keep track of. You go with the flow. And I'm like, oh, this is what it was like when I was a kid and I watched the movie Moonstruck and I had no idea what Catholicism was. I'm just going to go with this and I'm just going to trust that the filmmakers know what's going on. And so if you do that, that's what it is. And I've actually have not watched all 6. I have watched through the 3rd and I'm into the 4th. And I know that from the scuttlebutt online that there seems to be this feeling that the first 3 are the big ones. And then they kind of lose a little bit of the quality going into the final 3. But so far I'm fine with it. I've watched enough horror series in my life to know that there's gonna be a drop off in quality at some point, just because they're pumping them out. Like at this point, it's a series, and you're trying to get on to the next one. But so far, I'm saying like it's keeping up the quality as much as any Saw or Final Destination does. And as long as you're along for the ride, you're still getting that ride. So the SİCCÜN series, if you're looking for it, good luck. You're gonna have to find these movies. They're not mainstream releases in America. Honestly, they've been uploaded to YouTube. They've been uploaded to questionable websites. And I'm gonna say that the quality is going to lie entirely in the translation, in the subtitles that you're finding. But if you can find a more legit way, they've all been released on home media. If you're not averse to taking a chance and buying, Blu-rays from another country that you may or may not be aware of the sources you're getting, where you're getting them from, go for it. But otherwise, they've been uploaded a billion times to a different billion places. Also, the stars of these movies are very charming film stars, and they have Instagrams that you can go and follow, and I highly recommend that. Just sort of a peek behind the curtain of like the Turkish film industry. If you're really interested in seeing what it's like being a Turkish movie star, check out their Instagrams. There's just some delightful people and talented people who, I'm all about supporting people in whatever way you can find. Now, the next film that I checked out was a slightly more popular movie, Gonjiam Haunted Asylum. Now this, and the reason I bring it up is also because it opened my eyes to a filmmaker that I wasn't completely familiar with. So, but also this movie is a lot easier to find. I believe that Gonjiam Haunted Asylum is available. It might be on Shudder at this point. I know it was on Prime in America. So if you're looking for it, you can easily find it. Hold on. I swear to God, I had all these things pulled up, but then me being a person racked with adult hyperactivity disorder, I have about 70,000 windows open on my computer. Gonjiam Haunted Asylum. Yes, it's a so this is a South Korean found footage horror film directed by, again, I'm going to massacre your name, but that's, appropriate considering we're talking about horror films. Bum-shik, who is the writer and director of this little found footage film, and it's about a group of people who get together and go into a real haunted asylum. So this was a real asylum for a YouTube channel. So and they've been assembled by the people who are like the heads of this sort of like ghost hunting YouTube channel. And they all have their quirks and their little personalities. And the idea is that they're going to go into this asylum and do a ghost hunters type show, but may be more intense than we were anticipating. The spoilers for I won't even say the halfway point. Spoilers for the beginning-ish of the movie. You find out that a lot of it's a setup. But is it? Or are there actually real ghosts in this asylum? There's real ghosts in this asylum. The execution... First of all, the characters are all charming. And full disclosure, I love found footage horror. I am that guy. I love found footage. I am totally susceptible to its tropes. I am completely susceptible to all of the tricks of the trade. It's one of the few styles of storytelling that I'm a sucker for it. It punches my buttons. I know that a lot of people hate found footage horror. They find it cheap. They find it too easy. That's any horror. There's good and there's bad, and I would say that Gonjiam Haunted Asylum, it's not great, but it's not terrible. It's effective until it isn't, and once you figure out the twists and the turns, once you know what their limits are, you know that it's not going to get any worse than it is. Now, I know there are people who absolutely adore this movie, who find it terrifying, who find it quite a roller coaster ride. Once I realized where the story was going, it fell a little flat for me, but I definitely think it's worth a watch. There's enough good stuff in there that even if the ending doesn't nail it for you, it's totally worth watching. It's a lot of fun. And again, for me, when it comes to found footage, are the characters likable? The characters are totally likable. Are the characters all attractive? Yes, of course, the characters are all very attractive actors. Are the characters annoying? Yes, of course, the characters are annoying. It's found footage horror, but they're not annoying to the degree that you want them to die. That's my cutoff. Like, I don't have much patience for found footage horror that makes characters unlikable just because they want the audience to be rooting for their demise. I like found footage horror that makes the characters unlikable to a realistic degree, because most found footage is about young people. Most young people are annoying. So I say this as a man who's, what time is it? Pushing 50. So as a man who is who's close to entering the second half century of his life, most young people are annoying. Sorry. Any young people watching, you're going to be like me one day, and you're going to think the same exact thing. Young people, annoying. Now, that's two things that I've been watching. I've been watching. Oh, and I say have been watching. I knew there was another point I was going to make. Watching this, though, did make me intrigued enough about the director to seek out some of his other works. And Bum-shik, give me a second here, is one of the directors in the Horror Stories or Terror Stories series. So Horror Stories 2. He's also done a ton of other horror movies, but I started watching the Horror Stories series, which again, you can find them in a lot of places, but your enjoyment of them is going to depend on your ability to find good subtitles. And I found this interesting. Horror Stories is available to stream on like Tubi and places like that. But in some cases, it's edited. Some of the actual horror has been removed. Like, even though it's not indicated anywhere in the stream you're getting. I've actually found that Horror Stories, the first Horror Stories, which is, as it sounds, it's a series of horror stories, each one done by a different director, similar to like, you know, the VHS movies. Some of the streaming services have the horror removed, like the blood and stuff. And these aren't great movies. I mean, it's, you know, they're anthology films, so you got some good stuff, you got some bad stuff. But if the gore is cut out, you're actually missing, like, in some of their cases, the reason they exist. There's some creative gore in some of them that it just and they're edited like as if someone just picked up the celluloid and just yanked it out and then threw it back in the projector. Not that I think these things were ever actually projected on film. They may not have been. They may have been. I have a feeling some of them weren't. So if you're watching Horror Stories and all of a sudden it doesn't make any sense, that's because you're probably watching the edited for, I don't know, personal sensibilities version. So seek that out if you're watching Horror Stories or Horror Stories 2. Or they're sometimes translated as Terror Stories, because Horror Stories is a very vague name. Like, isn't that what we're watching? Isn't that why we're here? So I didn't pull up a little poster for Horror Stories just for Gonjiam Haunted Asylum. But those are the things that I've been, you know, in my very limited free time, I've been trying to keep up with. There's other things too, but those are the ones that like really stuck out to me. But I've also been reading. I'm a reader. I read, and I mentioned this on our last episode, and one of our listeners was like, "Ooh, I'm not familiar with that." So I've been reading the PTSD radio horror manga. Now, people are always looking for horror mangas to read, and they're like, what can I read? The big question I always hear is what's out there besides Junji Ito? And first of all, if you're into Junji Ito, go for it. They've been publishing these reprints of Ito's work, which are just phenomenal. This one is smashed, and you know, the idea is that most of them contain like just a ton of his short horror, you know, unless it's like the Tomy collection or like Spiral or Geo. They are, you know, mostly just little short works. And I think there's a new one coming out this month. So, you know, they're constantly putting them out in these wonderful hardback editions. So if you're into Junji Ito, you're not going to run out of any Junji Ito anytime soon. But you might be looking for someone else to get into. And so I would highly recommend, if you're willing to read a manga that might actually damage your psyche, cause you to be haunted unto death, you could do a lot worse than Masaki Nakayama's PTSD Radio. Now, PTSD Radio, also known as After Effects Radio Network. PTSD Radio isn't the actual like translation of it. That's kind of like the westernization of the concept. Is by Masaki Nakayama, who also wrote Seeds of Anxiety, Fuon no Tane, another horror manga. That's, if you've read Seeds of Anxiety, that's like it's like short. It's like kind of Junji Ito-ish in that it's short stories just sort of like strung together. And PTSD Radio seems like it might be that initially. It's weird. just sort of, I mean, some of the stories are just a couple of pages long, and they don't really seem to have any endings to them. And it takes a while before you start putting together that there is actually a narrative involved in these stories. There's it doesn't hold your hand, though. You've got to figure out what's going on by tracking the characters and the time. It's an anachronistic, all over the place timeline. It's complete anarchy. You've got to figure out how it all fits together. Nothing gets explained anytime soon. And then also, the story ends in a unsatisfying way, but also extremely satisfying considering why it ends. I'm just no spoilers, but the creator of the manga, Masaki Nakayama, went through his own issues while writing this, and that those play into what you're reading. Like the lines between fiction and reality start blending in a realistic way, like in a legitimate way, and his own personal psyche starts becoming damaged simply by creating this manga. And if you're looking at these covers that I'm showing you, they are upsetting, but the manga is far more upsetting. The basic gist of the story, for what it's worth, is that there is a spirit that is a benevolent spirit that protects sort of like a village in Japan, that starts getting asked to do some stuff that it isn't really cool with, and it kind of makes the spirit, like, it degrades the spirit in a certain way, and then people and this happens like hundreds of years ago, and then in modern Japan, the spirit is tapped into again unwittingly, and it starts like damaging the lives of the people who it comes in contact with in very upsetting ways. It's really hard to explain. It's a god of hair, apparently. Like hair. I mean, I know what you're thinking. You're like, oh, horror manga that deals with hair? Who would have thought? Well, this is one of them, but it's a lot more upsetting than that. PTSD Radio. It makes you experience anxiety as you're reading it. Not only because of what's happening, but because of the format. Like, it gets under your skin from the jump and doesn't let go. It's available in physical format. I read them digitally because I just can't keep track of books very well. But you can get it digitally, and it's totally worth it. If you're into horror manga, if you're not, give it a pass. But again, it's not going to hold your hand, but it's going to make you, it's going to scratch that itch. I've also been rereading, I don't have any images for it, but I've also been rereading the entire Drifting Classroom series, which is an decades old horror manga. I was like, does it hold up? I read Drifting Classroom like 18 years ago, like 15 years ago, when the volumes first became available at the local public library. And I was like, does Drifting Classroom, does it still pack a punch? Yes, it does. If you've never read Drifting Classroom, highly recommended horror manga. It'll keep you busy for a while because there's a lot to it. And it's about an elementary school, like kindergarten through like grade 6, that disappears and reappears in a blasted wasteland. Like there's like an earthquake, and the kids are like, what's going on outside? And suddenly their elementary school is surrounded by just absolutely nothing. And it's kind of like Lord of the Flies meets Battle Royale meets like nightmarish Lovecraftian wasteland horrors. It's, if you want to see a story about children fighting for their lives surrounded by an irradiated nothingness, but also there's like terrifying monsters, and the adults lose it as soon as everything starts, and wholesale slaughter of the innocent, Drifting Classroom is awesome. The characters are very fun. You have no idea where it's going. It just grabs your hand and yanks you along. So Drifting Classroom is another good one. The last thing I want to talk about, the last thing that I'm reading here. I know I'm just sort of like rambling, but I wanted to get I wanted to give our listeners, our viewers, their money's worth, which is nothing, which is what they come to expect from us. A payback for nothing. Is I've been reading David Sodergren's horror works. They're all available on I know they're available through Prime, through Amazon. So that's where I first discovered him. Someone said, "Hey, have you ever read David Sodergren?" I actually realized that I had picked up one of his books at some point, but I don't remember names very well. So actually, it wasn't. I'm showing The Forgotten Island right now, but that's not where I started. I actually started with. Well, nope. That's not what I was going for. I'm very bad at this. I actually started with his novel The Har. Let me just move this over. The Har. And only because I was attracted to the cover. I know you cannot judge a book by its cover, but I was like, I'm gonna do that. And so I picked up the Har, and Har is like a Scottish term for like fog that like rolls in off the sea. I thought it was just going to be monsters coming out of the fog type story. Not that at all. I mean, there is monsters, but the fog actually plays like a very like small role in this story. It's actually a story of a Scottish village that is being taken over by developers who are buying out all the villagers, and like there's a few holdouts who don't want to leave, like the older villagers don't want to leave, and so the developers start terrorizing them, like trying to get them to leave. And the main character, this 80-year-old Scottish woman, finds it, and this is going to sound familiar to anyone who's read Jeff Vandermeer, finds kind of a protoplasmic single cell type creature that begins growing and is very much, if you've read Born, it's similar to Born in a lot of ways. She finds out that this thing is intelligent and is able to mimic and recreate the appearance of people, but also requires in a Little Shop of Horrors Bucket of Blood-esque twist, requires blood and meat to survive. And so you have this sort of like deal she's made with this entity that to supply her with companionship, basically. And it sounds a little hokey, and it is a little hokey, but it's also very well written. One thing that really appealed to me about Sodergren is that he's a good writer. He's a Scottish writer. His prose is propulsive. It's repulsive at times. There's a lot of body horror involved, but Sodergren is he's a good writer. Like, he's a solid writer. I have pretty high tolerance for garbage. I mean, you read a lot of horror, you're just like, you know what, this person isn't really going to win any awards, but that's not what I'm here for. But I consider myself a pretty good judge of solid writing, and I'm saying that Sodergren is a solid writer. Here comes this phrase again, though. He's not reinventing the wheel. This isn't someone who is playing around with prose stylings, who is experimenting with the format. This is a guy who's just, I'm writing solid horror stories. And if you're looking for something, if you're looking for a writer who is just going to give you solid characters, solid plots, solid scares, solid gross amounts, then I mean that's what you're looking for. He knows what he's doing. You're gonna find some compelling stuff. Forgotten Island, I believe, is his first novel, and it's also solid stuff. There's goblins haunting an island, and people end up on it. And what happens? You're going to have to read it to find out. But again, the characters, he's good at writing characters. Like these characters are compelling. I would actually put his character like development up there with like, let's say like 1970s to early 80s Stephen King. Like those short stories where like in just a few short paragraphs, King has invested you in the lives of these characters. I'm not comparing him to like the novels of that period, mostly the short stories, in the sense that the characters are sketchy, like loose sketches of characters, but you're still invested in them, and you don't want them to get hurt. Like you want things to work out for these characters. And that's something that I look for in horror. I'm not looking for victims. I'm looking for fighters. I don't want bad things to happen to these characters. I want to see how they get out of it. Of course, bad things are going to happen to these characters. That's the nature of the game. But when they do happen, I feel bad. And to me, that's successful horror, is I feel bad about the stuff that's about to happen to these people. So yeah, David Sodergren, if you, I do Prime, so I know that he's available on Primes. I don't buy a lot of physical books. I read a lot of stuff digitally. So that's where I've been horror-wise for the last few weeks. I've been just sort of dipping in and dipping out of these writers and these artists and keeping myself entertained. So we'll be back next week with our coverage of The Jolly Corner by Henry James. I'm going to give you a little sneak peek. I really like this short story, but it's a really difficult story in the sense that Henry James does not say in 5 words what he can say in 15 words. And so if you're reading along with the show, trust me, Jolly Corner takes you need to read it a couple of times in order to like really get what James is going for. Or I'm just not very smart. Maybe that's the case. But thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for watching. I don't have anything else to say. I'll see you all next time. Wait, that's my other show. I am Phil, and see you next week on It's Del Toro Time. Or as Willow would say, goodbye.